Hey, Rich Sealing here, and I want to tell you a secret. You're underexposing your photographs, but you're not going to know this unless you use this special tool called RAWDigger to evaluate your photographs. And in this video, I'm going to give you a basic introduction to RAWDigger and show you how to determine if you're underexposing and by how much you're underexposing. So keep watching and you're going to learn something new.
About 80% of the exposures I look at are a stop and a half more underexposed. And that means you're losing a stop and a half or more of shadow detail. You're not capturing all the information your camera is capable of. You're really just getting like a third of the potential out of your camera. And you're not getting as good a results as you could. The only way you're going to find that out is to use something like RAWDigger to evaluate your exposures. In fact, RAWDigger is the only application that I know of that lets me look at my raw data without any processing. When you look at your photographs in Lightroom, it's showing you some processing. When you look at them in Photoshop, it's showing you some processing. You're not really seeing what's truly in the file and the true exposure. You need RAWDigger to do that. I'm using the $20 exposure edition. You can get a 30-day free demo to try this out yourself. I just want to walk you through a bracket of this exposure and show you what's going on. And first, I want to show you how to tell if the photograph's underexposed. And we need to look at the histogram to do that. RAWDigger lets you bring up the histogram through the histogram window here. And I've made a change. On your camera, the histogram is showing something like this. It's kind of a linear relationship, and that's talking about the vertical axis here. RAWDigger gives us some other tools to change how this graph is plotted. And if I change it to logarithmic, you can see it stretches this out and it can show 1 pixel being overexposed or 5 pixels being overexposed in these lines on this graph. A lot more useful for reading the histogram in this case. And what we find out is our exposure should fall. Optimum exposure happens here at about 16,000. On this scale. And what this scale is the luminosity values for each one of these channels. In a 14-bit capture, which most mirrorless or DSLRs are going to let you do, you can capture up to 16,384 luminance values for any pixel that's on there. And this is showing how many pixels there are on the vertical axis and what luminance value they are on the horizontal. And it turns out the brightest pixel falls about right there, just a little past the 4,000. What is that? Well, it's not 16,000. This isn't going to tell me. I'm actually going to look at another part of RAWDigger up here that shows me the maximum pixel value for green. And it turns out that pixel is 5,467. So out of 16,384, I'm at about a third of the value that I could get there. I'm not getting even close to the full potential of the sensor. It's like I went to the gas station, the sign says no gas for 100 miles. Instead of filling up, I just put a third of a tank of gas in it. I don't think that's what we want to do. So the challenge is, how underexposed am I? And how many in stops? What would I do to fix this? And RAWDigger gives us a way to do that. If we look at the top of the horizontal axis, this is our luminance values. Here are EVs, or exposure value, and each one of these is one stop apart. So I'm going to borrow the bottom here, the blues exposure values, to map up to here. If 4 is our optimum exposure, I can't expose brighter than that with blowing out. 3 is one stop underexposed. We've got a one stop difference. And then we've got these little gray tick lines that I've turned on here by choosing grid 1/3 EV. I'm 1 2/3 underexposed for this photograph. So 1 2/3 underexposure might not sound like a lot to you. You can see you're only getting a third of your data. Let's see what happens if we walk through this bracket and we're going to add a third of a stop of exposure. And you can see here, this is at 0.3 seconds. You can follow what's going on with the XIF data right here for this. And I'm going to use the quick keys to move to the next file that's at a half a second. And you can see where that histogram is moved about a third of a stop. So now I'm from that 4 to 3, I'm like a stop underexposed. We're just splitting some hairs on that last little bit. We're not going to count that. So still underexposed, captured more data, but I can still add more exposure. And if I look at the 0.7 second exposure, again, we can see that exposure moved about a third of a stop, and we're now just 2/3 of a stop underexposed. Still could capture a little bit more data. This is a really usable exposure. Any of these could work. but you start to lose things, lose vibrancy, you don't get as much richness. You really do want to expose as far to the right as you can, and then you use whatever you get out of that. But let's see what happens if we add 1/3 second more. We'll go up to 1 second exposure. What we find is I'm getting really close to that 4 EV 16,000 line, and I'm past this third stop line. This is an optimum exposure. I've exposed as far to the right as I can and still hold detail in the brightest part of the photograph, which happens to be this water in the rapids. Any more exposure would blow out that detail. So this is an optimum exposure for this photograph. The only way I'm going to know that is if I'm looking at RAWDigger. And if you're bracketing right here, you need RAWDigger to tell you which one of those do you want to process, at least from the exposure standpoint. And we also need this to unlock the next step. If you're one of these people, go through your photographs, take some of your favorites that you've processed, look at the raw file in here, see how well you did with the exposure, and keep track of where you're going. And if you find out you're chronically underexposing, well, that's going to be the impetus to take the next step, that we can use RAWDigger to help us solve that better and get a better exposure in camera.
Hey, thanks for watching, and click the subscribe button if you want to watch more videos like this. And you can head over to my website, richsealing.com, check out my blog. I've got workshops, a lot more opportunities to keep learning photography. Thanks for watching today, and look forward to sharing more with you next time.